And I started to think writing is an act of design, an act of creation. And so I started lecturing there. I did history surveys there. I taught in the School of Architecture. I ended up teaching in crits and design studio. I did all sorts of things, even though I wasn't faculty. It was a kind of form of abuse, you could say. But I ended up doing all sorts of things. And I ended up becoming friends with the history department, and they gave these seminars every week. And I loved sitting evening seminars, and I'd sit them and go up for a beer in the common room upstairs and have a chat. And I sat with them, and I was riven because they all talked about everything. They were so eclectic. They would jump on one subject and jump on another, and they go, oh yes, and they jump on. They're like little magpies of knowledge, and they just like, forget Trivial Pursuits. They just knew so much. They were omnivorous people. And I was giddy with this kind of sense of, whoa, my brain just exploded. That
these were
historians in the history department
okay.
at Hong Kong U. And I just thought, is this what a historian is? Like, is this what they are? Which meant no limits. Talk about anything you like and connect it to anything else, as long as it happened. So I mean, that's pretty big. So I realized it's not a subject, it's a meta thing. It's not, although I don't like that word meta, but for want of a better word, it is a kind of, it's non-disciplinary, it's anti-disciplinary in some ways, history.
It's almost confining to call it almost, I don't know if you agree, but to have that term historian, because I think everyone to some degree will have some affinity to what we call history. I remember at school I did history at GCSE level, and I remember thinking, and the subjects we learned, it was so specific. It was, in the last 100 years, but then there's stuff way before that, and it's like, it's so confining to almost just call it history in a way, because like you say, it relates to all of us. So everyone's, you could almost, I was talking with a friend about this, actually, we're all to some degree products of war. Whether it's our immediate parents or grandparents, or much further back.
And your work.
Right.
John. Yes. That's true. Yes.
So and like, I remember when I was in school as a kid, all the kids, I went to a Church of England school, so I was one of the only Muslims in my class, and I remember all the kids would be talking about, oh, my granddad was on an AA battery in the Second World War. My grandma was working on Spitfires and all this kind of thing. And recently, the work I've done with the Muslim War Memorial, we've been looking at the Muslim involvement in the Second World Wars that a lot of Muslims aren't aware of. And we talk about the Monte Cassino, one of the famous battles of the Second World War, which had huge regiments of British Indian soldiers, Muslims, Punjabs, who liberated, Europe's soft underbelly, as Churchill called it. So it affects all of us, and it's linked to all of us. And then, so it's like, if you want to look at, it seems like we associate war a lot with history.
Yeah.
And colonization and these sorts of themes.
Yes. I mean, I wasn't going to go this direction, but I'm actually half Indian, half Irish, so there's a kind of definitely I'm a product of colonization. My dad's very complex. He's half Anglo-Indian, half Jewish, Isfahani Jew, I discovered, which was really interesting, which I didn't know. The Jews of Calcutta, which is very, very large diaspora that now collapsed to about 20 people.
Wow.
They run I lived in Calcutta for a while during my research, and I just tried to discover the backstory of my name's fake. That's another thing. My name is Cohen, not Cowell. I'm just saying it for the first time, and I was thinking, but my grandfather's name was Elias Jacob Cohen, and he concealed it and called himself Edward James Cowell.
Why did he do that?
I think it's because he was an only child and he was disowned by his family, and he knew a major in the army, someone who served in the First World War or near the First World War, who he admired, and his name was Cowell, and he became his surrogate father, and he signed his marriage certificate.
Wow.
So he just adopted the name Cowell. It was close to Cohen, very similar sounding, and he just anglicized the other bits of him, and he basically hung out constantly with the Anglo-Indian community in India.
And he was English Indian, or?
He was Persian Jew, full Persian Jew.
Wow.
And came over with his family from Persia to Calcutta, and a lot of Jews came over from Syria, Syrian Jews and Baghdadi Jews and Isfahani Jews, and they came over to India to work in various areas, investment and all that stuff, but also
Is this because they
jewelry, particularly under the Mughals. The Jews were involved, I believe, in jewelry and jewelers and things like that. But my grandfather must have been quite recent. He's a mysterious. He's not found in the Jewish trail of record keeping. I went to see a family there, the Sillimans. I spent one lovely Sunday, whole day almost, with them. They live off Park Street in Calcutta and next to the Martiniere Girls' School. And we went through their records, and they're very, very methodical. And I couldn't find my grandfather's name in any of the volumes. And she said, well, you know, he may have not studied here. He may have come over as a first, generation immigrant, and he wouldn't have gone to school here. He wouldn't have found the records here. And I also know he tried to hide his name and tried to work. He worked on the East Bengal Railway as a train driving instructor. He got TB. He died young. But that whole thing of being, she said, no self-respecting Jew would work on the railways. I go, well, obviously he saw himself as an Anglo-Indian. So he kind of rejected his identity and he changed it. And
what time period are you talking here?
So this would have been
during the British
Raj.
It
would have been after the First World War. So we're talking about the late 1910s to 1920s, early 1920s. This is when he was pulling away from the family. And then he married my grandmother. And then he just converted to Catholicism, actually.
And your grandmother's
an
Anglo-Indian
who would have been Catholic, because a lot of the Anglo-Indians were Catholic. For some very interesting reason, I wondered why, especially in Calcutta, why not Anglican, because it's called Anglo-Indian, which meant that they were Eurasians. Somewhere down the line, say an English officer married an Indian woman, say in the 19th century, and they formed a community, and almost all Anglo-Indians would be Christian. But the question was, why a preponderance of them are Catholic? It did make me wonder. And I started to think maybe perhaps the sort of miscegenation that was going was with Irish soldiers and Indian women, and that would have led to the Catholic inheritance. So it's possibly because Irish were treated as very low-grade whites by the British and the British Empire. And you heard the Black Irish, this phrase in America used. I don't know if you heard it, but it was used very derogatory in America. So I'm really sensitive to race, is what I'm trying to get to.
What do you mean when you say sensitive to race?
Sensitive to the nuances, not in any kind of pejorative sense, but I'm almost a delight in the melding and playing with the slipperiness of it. I'm very interested in it being unclear. I like it being a little bit blended or messed up, because I like the iconoclasm of resisting discourses of race. I kind of like denying it.
Denying the homogeny.
Denying the tribalism of it. Denying the simplification of it being, my identity is this. And I'll say, well, I can throw a bomb at that and show that there's a fissure in that seemingly, sleek little cell you've put yourself in.
It's interesting how we cycle. This comes back to the point of stories. We tell ourselves a story that we become proud of something, and we keep telling ourselves that story, and we deny that there could be a lot more to what's going on in our own history. And in fact, Ajay and I were talking about this, about the fact that although you can have people from different ethnic backgrounds, different, you could say colors or whatever, but what about the way they think? And actually, when I was growing up, I grew up thinking, well, I'm from a Pakistani family. We must all probably think politically sort of the same thing. And it was when I was sort of 14, 15, I remember talking to my aunt and uncle about certain, things that were going on. And they had different views, right? And it was the first time I thought, well, actually, just because we're the same color doesn't mean, and even within my own family, doesn't mean we all think the same things.
No.
And then the more you learn, obviously, with my own, the things I've done, which are much more historically based with the Muslim War Memorial. As part of that project, we interviewed Sergeant Mohammed Hussein, who's thought to be the last remaining Muslim Indian soldier living in Britain today. He's 100 years old. And his view on...
Amazing.
It's amazing. It was an absolutely amazing experience, and he
Aura.
And it was incredible, and it was an amazing interview. And the amazing thing for me was that he sat there saying, "I was so proud to be British. Like serving for Britain was the proudest thing I've done." And I remember thinking, and there were stories. Various historians know of the fact that some people in India were kidnapped, and thrown into the British Army, sent to Europe to fight, and. But his, and it's very valid, just because he doesn't agree with the fact that, well, the British did, you could say, colonize, and they, maybe subjugated parts of that population, but he doesn't see it that way. He sees it as an honor that he fought for Britain.
Yeah, well, the fact is I've spent so much of my years reading and getting immersed in colonial court discourses that I've gone so past the judgmental stage of it that I went through the whole stage of, because as British kids, you start thinking, well, there's nothing wrong in British Empire. It's all so fine. People enjoyed it and they did good things. And then you start to read and go, oh no, this is terrible. What they did is awful. And then you start to become the opposite and you go very negative and this is awful and really horrible and everything's bad. And
so how did you tackle that?
I tackle it by abstaining from judgment and just looking at what happened. And it's a very good question, Mohammed, you've asked, actually, because it is a question that holds me in tension. It's not calm or resolved. It's agitated. I'm in a state of agitated suspension in which I hold back from making blanket views of something, and I just work out what happened. And then when I go into it, my biases will then rearrange the material. And if I feel, as I often do, that this is really dark and awful and diabolical, what they did, I will just do a sardonic, black, humorous set of connections that start to show up the hypocrisy of the act and start to highlight it.
To what degree?
Yeah, there's something I've written which I can't quite talk about at the moment, but in 2 weeks or more I can, and I'll tell you more about that one. But
well, why didn't you talk about it? Because this won't be released for another few months.
Oh, okay. Oh, fine. How can I put it? This is something that we might have to talk about in the editing process.
Of course.
And this has to be absolutely discreet.
No, it's between us, okay. And this isn't going out until you've seen it. So
I won a thing called the Hawksmoor medal, but it hasn't been released until 2 weeks from now, and it's a medal. It's from the Society of Architectural Historians of Great Britain, and it is for the best essay in competition in the world.
Wow.
So
congratulations, that's amazing.
In the English language. And it is on hill stations of India, and it's about the relationship between height and colonialism, the discovery of height and altitude and medical sanatoria, and the relationship between medical sanatoria and white settler colonialism. There were paradoxical projects. One was to take people from the cantonments in the plains of the Indo-Gangetic plains up into the Himalayas at high level at a certain height, and they started testing heights. What would be the Goldilocks band where white people could survive and get medicated and be healed and come down again?
Why white people? Was it not affecting?
Well, here we go, right? Because the Europeans had sepoys, which were the native Indian soldiers, usually Brahmin from Patna, Benares, and Bengal. And then before they had the Sikh, this is a pre-Sikh army. And then they had white Royal Army soldiers and therefore European cantonments. And they obviously valued the Europeans more. They cost more. cost them more to ship. As a money thing, whites cost a lot more expensive kit. And they wanted to make sure they were well treated, and they found out that they were getting fatigued in the heat. And they made presumptions that Indians didn't suffer as much, and they were healthy and all this business. But they also wanted to pull the Europeans away from the Indian populations by about 1810. And so I start to look at architectural sections and how the surveyors start to cut India vertically. And they start to take India. 1815, the Treaty of Nagali, they take Nepal. And suddenly they have, in 1815, height. They didn't have that dimension before. And the real problem question is, why did they not build the first medical sanatoria until 1827, 12-year gap? And no historian has ever asked that question. Why the gap? Why the hesitancy? And it's to do with a whole invention of an ideology of height and settler colonialism relationships. And so the essay talks about how they climb up to a height. They take the first medical sanatoriums at Landor and Missouri, and as they populate Landor, they realize that the Missouri are these invalided troops with Eurasian children coming up and following them and wanting to be healed. And so it starts to create a problem. The whole point of the medical sanatoria was to heal and come down, but they start to think, no, let's keep them up there and colonize. And it's almost like the Eurasians are the taunting thing. They don't want mixed children, but they also don't want them mixing and polluting with the brown children below. And so the cost of taking an invalid patient to recuperate in England is very costly. And they realize the cost of affording them to recuperate at high level and keeping whites up at high level starts to become a security idea. They can start to colonize with a twin idea, strategy of high-level cantonments and low-level cantonments. And they can start to push against Afghanistan because they start to, after 1842 and the fleeing of Kabul, they use it as a buffer zone to the Kush. And so they start to create this corridor along the West Himalayas.
This is after the British troops were pushed out of
after 1842. Yes, so Lord Ellenborough starts to use height and colonialism as a security feature. It's very complex, but what I'm trying to say is there's a strong connection between height, health, and white settler colonialism, and it's very complex. In a way, I'd like to. Once I can talk about it, I'd like to talk more about it. But it was part of my PhD actually, a long discourse of the discovery of height in the cantonment systems of India. But I'm kind of, I don't know why I'm bringing that up and not this, but it is. But that story of height feeds into backwards. It's like a prequel of this, because I wrote parts of this first, and I think I wouldn't have got to the height story if I hadn't worked on Hong Kong. But Hong Kong's a mini story, if you like, of this height. Like, for example, if I can find it, there's this so if you look at that, for example, this is a figure 3.10. You see how they climb up and they start slicing the tops of hills to create, this is a hospital, the Seamen's Hospital, and they start to believe that height will save them from the malaria. And then they where's the other one? It must be after this. Oh, I think it is before that.
You need to send me a photo of that page.
I will. So, and then this is the height relationship of the warehouses and this is the rich merchant, East Point 1, and this is how he lives up on this hill, and the malaria attack was down here in Happy Valley. It's called Wong Nai Chong. And this is Causeway Bay. And so height differences start to make, they seem imperceptible height differences start to make a big difference in their heads. And this idea of height and health, I think, comes from the Sanatoria story of India. And so in a way, I accidentally wrote the prequel to this. And that's, I entered it for this SAHGB essay thing, competition in summer. and I'm very honoured that I got
That's
it. So,
incredible.
yeah.
That's incredible,
so
Chris.
there's a ceremony on the 6th of December.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, but you're the first person I've told.
Well, I'm honoured. This is a return honour for taking the left seat. So no, that's amazing.